I've put together a little potted history. Feel free to interject at any point, Samir, but I'm going to go through this little potted history. We're going to start with 1964, which is when there was a merger of several kind of construction companies, civil engineering companies, but primarily sort of materials and road building companies and road aggregate companies that formed what was kind of officially called Tarmac Derby, I think. And then they kind of lost. They stopped calling themselves Tarmac Derby fairly quickly, and were just called Tarmac. And they had the 7 T's here, which was their logo for quite a long time. This was Tarmac, and they were founded. I think it was primarily Midlands. They had their base in. Oh golly, where was it? It was possibly Derby actually, or near Derby. Anyway, they were like Midlands based, but obviously grew pretty rapidly, and in fact grew pretty rapidly to become international. And this was their logo right the way until 1996, when they 90sified and got a slightly snazzier typefacey logo. But by this point, by 1996, they had worked, Tarmac had worked on, they'd moved from being just like a road aggregates provider to being a house builder in quite a big way. In fact, they were a major house builder through the 70s and 80s, particularly the 80s. Major civil engineering projects that they were working on, so like motorways galore. I think they built 10% of Britain's motorways, actually, Tarmac. I think pretty spectacular, sizable chunk of sort of roads being built, like major civil engineering projects globally. In fact, lots of projects. And then in 1990, so from 1996 moved to 1999, and they were told by, or it's a mixture of their own decision. You might know better than me on this. A mixture of their own decision, or they were told to enact a demerger. So their demerger involved splitting what eventually is today Tarmac as part of CRH, and splitting away from that in 1999 was Carillion, and this was Carillion was formed of their civil engineering contractor business, so the kind of the construction business, right? So not the bits that did materials and sort of aggregates, also not the house building bits. The house building bits, they did a bit of a swap. I think the house building bits, Carillion or Tarmac and Wimpey did like a bit of a swap, I think. So the house building bits of Tarmac went to Wimpey, and the civil engineering bits of Wimpey went to Tarmac, which then ended up in Carillion, I think. Correct me if any of this is not quite right, Samir, but I think this is basically what happened. So there's a demerger which created Carillion in 1999. And between 2001 and 2014, they got a new chief exec in 2001, and they basically went for a massive period of acquirements and growth, and gobbling up lots of smaller companies. So particular names here that might be familiar to people is John Lang are in there, Alfred McAlpine there. Molem is another one that's kind of major kind of, these quite a lot of big kind of contracting organizations, big civil engineering companies. And they were just growing. That was up to 2014. Now, if we skip back a little... actually, before we skip back a little, talk about how Carillion were involved in the railways. Well, they started out, so back in 1999, they had a small stake within sort of railway maintenance organisations. As you can see, here's a rather dilapidated-looking, knackered tamper. Here is the tamper, with a Carillion logo on it. There's the Carillion logo that's been sellotaped on. Looking rather dilapidated, but they started out with this. But by 2014... Carillion were Network Rail's biggest contractor, biggest individual contractor, being paid £281 million that financial year. That's if we ignore the fact that Balfour Beatty are bigger, but they're weirdly split into 3 bits. But they got paid £350 million total. So if you like, Carillion were Network Rail's second biggest contractor, but they were huge. A third of a billion. The best part of a third of £1 billion of contracts let and controlled by Carillion. So they're a major player. And I was doing work for Carillion. Carillion were, when I started in the industry, I was working for Atkins, and all of my work was on the Midland Main Line underneath Carillion. We were working for Carillion as part of the major kind of Midland Main Line sort of CP5, Control Period 5, kind of multi-asset framework sort of contract they had. Huge sort of kind of multi-project spanning framework of a lot of Midland Mainline stuff going on, particularly electrification, but also some of the other big civil engineering projects down there. And in fact, I was going to put it up here. I've got video footage that I was taking on site of Carillion building things. There's all people in oranges with Carillion on their back, a bit like this, and sparks flying everywhere. So in the thick of it, they were building things. Now, if we roll back very slightly to October 2012, for reasons that we will explain a little bit later, October 2012, Carillion got involved in a thing called reverse factoring. And the general attitude was this was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then a fairly short period later, in March 2015, UBS, some consultants analysts in UBS were looking at Carillion and commented on the fact that they reckoned that reverse factoring is very bad and it was going to be really bad. So that was a bit of a flip on the old reverse factoring. We'll explain what reverse factoring is very soon. Don't worry, everyone. So you just need to bear in mind that within a fairly short space of time, we went from people thinking this is a very good thing to suddenly people think it's a very bad thing. And indeed, by July 2017, Carillion are announcing £1.15 billion of losses. And I put this in inverted commas because, by the 13th of January 2018, things had gone from bad to worse. And the BBC started reporting that there was a matter of days to stop the collapse of Carillion. I remember this in the news because I'd moved to a different company and was dealing with Carillion quite a bit less. And so it didn't feel quite as immediate. But I was aware of the pain that a lot of my colleagues were starting to suffer, particularly actually a lot of my project managers, because they were the commercial people were dealing with the fact that they had no idea whether the money was going to come through for the projects that they just had a load of designers working on non-stop for months. And then, sure enough, 15th of January 2018, Carillion disintegrated. It collapsed. It went into liquidation. So that was the end of Carillion. That was their demise. Samir, any of your own memories of this period, or anything that you can add over this bit of history?
I mean, I remember it seemed to kind of fall over very quickly, but clearly, like the writing was on the wall kind of months earlier. And one of the things that is often picked up is that back in July when they issued their profit warning, their shares plummeted, but of course within a matter of days they were awarded. There was a contract of around £1.4 billion for work on HS2.
Yep.
Then a few months later, I think maybe in November, were awarded a contract in the hundreds of millions for the electrification of the, I think, London to Northampton line. So, it feels very surreal that those two things kind of coincided, given that the underlying problems in the company seem to be pretty apparent by July.